Hi Nick, so what is the current state of SME developers in the UK housing market and are things improving or getting worse?
So, according to all reasonable analysis, the SME house building sector is in a state of economic collapse at the moment.
And why is that, Nick?
Well, there's a number of factors. I mean, as we know, all homes, land development, and most economic growth starts with the planning system. And according to current statistics from most independent analysis, the Housing Building Federation or so on, small house builders, small sites, typically a hectare or less, mostly in urban locations, traditionally delivered over 35% of the UK's housing supply. However, that's been under increasing pressure over the last decade or so. And what we're seeing is that in 2026, through economic pressures, through cost of living, through planning problems, it's likely that the SME sector is going to deliver less than 2,000 new homes nationally this year, which is a shocking collapse.
Obviously, SME developers sort of fall in that. So why is their role declining and what are the reasons for that?
Well, historically, SME developers have always been able to operate on a smaller margin than the major house builders, and they've been able to and focused on being locally flexible and adapting to local needs. The margins for a typical SME developer were usually around 4.7% recently, and on a turnover of less than 10 million. These are not big businesses. They're making less than £500,000 profit a year. However, due to a kind of almost catastrophic mix of increased regulation, increased tax through national insurance, etc., and uncertain planning delays, as well as things like building safety changes and sales exit uncertainty, has really meant that house builder profit margins for small developments and small sites have completely collapsed. Failure to sell even one or two flats within the programme that developers had originally scheduled can risk putting them into insolvency. There are many factors, but I guess really what I wanted to talk about now was the planning aspect of it, and the fact that the general political perception of greedy house builders is completely wrong when you're talking about small sites and the SME sector. These are economically vital businesses delivering GDP growth that are not making big margins.
I mean, do you see that trend reversing it anyway, or do you think the market or the way the planning system is currently just isn't possible for that to happen?
Well, perversely, the thing that gives me some hope is that if we look at the planning system and the way that it's broken in terms of policy and process at the moment is so bad that that gives me some hope that we know that the government are very enthusiastic about trying to support new home building, but the thing that there's a greater prospect of actual change being done at a level that could make a difference.
I mean, are there any particular changes you think that need to be done to the planning system to help that?
The planning system, the NPPF, is very large and quite complex, and I'm not an expert on all aspects of it. And that's one of the challenges, actually, in that you have somewhat conflicting and overlaying bureaucracy, and continually changing the NPPF and the planning policies creates uncertainty, which, as any business owner will tell you, is not good. Business owner, especially when you're doing a housing development, which is really a 3, 4, 5 year project, trying to project out what your costs might be over that period of time, what the cost of debt might even be, given the current macroeconomic uncertainty in the world. There are many factors behind that. I'd be happy to talk a bit more about them, but that it's quite a complex subject. There's not one silver bullet, sadly.
So do you want to expand on some of the issues you just mentioned, and then obviously have you got any solutions you think would be something that could be implemented?
Well, let's talk about some of the challenges first. Even the NPPF and the local plan system and the processes remained within that. Even, sadly, even the latest improvements that the government brought in last year actually add to the level of bureaucracy. There's been no reduction in the amount of admin and paperwork required as a starting point. The current discretionary planning system that we have in the UK is kind of riddled with contradictions that often cause open-ended planning delay and uncertainty. This is a big problem for all developers, but particularly for SMEs who are trying to operate on tight margins, who don't have big cash reserves, who, if a planning application is supposed to take 3 months, but really it takes 18 months, that could mean the difference between a project being viable in the broadest economic sense or the developer going bankrupt before they've even put a spade in the ground. What that does is it kind of creates effectively a NIMBY open goal to people who wish to object and delay. There are no incentives for the planning officers or local authorities to stick to the mandatory targets, and there's no real consequences of them taking longer than the process is supposed to, whereas it can be catastrophic to the applicants.
Okay. And do you find that that's obviously different councils have different sort of local plans and different ideas about what they do in terms of how they approve planning and what they want happening in their borough, so to speak? Do you find that differs depending on around the country, or is it a general issue that's prevalent everywhere?
There are some boroughs, and we've done applications in many different boroughs over the years. There are some boroughs that are very efficient, and certainly in my experience, most planning officers are very professional. However, the reality is that if you look at an SME small site, say you're trying to bring forward 20 new homes in a 3/4 of a hectare site in an urban regeneration site, that would require typically 20 to 25 separate specialist reports that would cost between £50,000 to £60,000 with no certainty of planning approval because of the discretionary nature of the process. This is largely the same reporting requirements as would be for a 1,000-home major developer scheme on the Greenbelt, and seems disproportionate to the type of project and the economic benefits. I think we can all agree that generally regenerating existing buildings is, in the broadest sense, relatively more environmentally friendly than a new build scheme on the Greenbelt.
Yeah. Okay.
Things like the transport infrastructure, other infrastructure are already in place. And the embedded carbon repositioning, which is not necessarily well metriced in a lot of the ESG reporting, is quite logically often already, if you're repurposing or repositioning a building already in situ. By legislative accident, if I can say that, conflicting environmental and biodiversity criteria often and NIMBY objectors see no direct benefit in their agenda in helping expedite planning decisions. For example, the recent debacle about nutrient neutrality has blocked over 150,000 homes for quite some time in terms of coming forward. And that's a very good example where environmental policy has trumped the fact that we have a housing crisis through unintended consequence. Why should it be that new homes should be carrying 100% of the burden of meeting nutrient neutrality costs when actually new homes will be responsible for about 2% of the problem? So, I mean, coming back to local planning officers, they are currently under siege. The average planning officer, according to my understanding, is typically managing over 50 planning applications at any one time, which will, even for small sites, involve reviewing at least 20 reports, as I've just talked about, and hundreds of pages of documents, as well as collating responses from dozens of consultees who have their own agenda, their own objectives, and it's an overwhelming challenge for planning officers to manage that in a timely basis. No wonder things are taking longer than they should. Within that, you also have, as we just talked about really, different local authorities regularly taking opposing positions on the same piece of kind of legislative policy within the MPPF. And it's not even that you know a certain borough is going to always act a certain way. They could change on any given day. We try to engage with local authorities doing planning pre-apps, for example, like a lot of developers. Sadly, they're often not worth the paper they're written on, because you go through the consultation process and it's all matters are reserved and they can change their mind, and it gives you some indication, but it doesn't necessarily deliver the benefits it's supposed to, for example.
On pre-apps, essentially you're saying that whilst they have their use, they're no longer as useful and don't guarantee essentially anything, do they now?
Well, pre-apps never guaranteed an output, but it was, it's intended to be, as I understand it, a constructive way of engaging with planning officers to understand the local policy requirements and what hurdles there might need to be to get a planning approval progress constructively and collaboratively.
Yeah.
The challenge that planning officers have is that, whilst they wish to be collaborative and they have their housing targets to meet, there are so many other influencing factors on them within a local authority. Different local authorities often take opposite positions on the same policy matters, and it's not as if actually they're necessarily consistent within each local authority over time. Policies change very much depending on the mood of the local politicians, which means the risk and the timeline in planning for developers becomes ever more risky and ever longer as things take longer to consult. No consultation ever reduced the timeline to get a planning decision, sadly.
Do you think, therefore, that SME developers are better suited to certain types of sites compared to the larger house builders?
Absolutely. SMEs are usually more local businesses by their very nature, and they're usually very embedded in the local economy and the local society. They're much more likely to take on brownfield regeneration projects, infield sites, in a more sensitive way that genuinely creates diversity of product and is good for the built environment.
If you could change one aspect of the planning system to unlock more housing, what would it be?
The thing about planning reform is that it's a uniquely low-cost way for the government to address both our potential national housing crisis, which I think we all know is a big problem, and unleash economic growth for the UK. Particularly, this can be done through SMEs. I mean, the analysis from the House Building Federation over the last year is that it's very likely that unless planning reform is done in some substantive way, the government is going to miss its 1.5 million houses target over the term of this Parliament by more than 500,000 houses as we sit here today. That would mean probably their performance is even worse than the last government, which was, without getting into politics, from a homelessness crisis perspective, from a national growth perspective, is not a good place to be. There is a huge opportunity And unlike all the other things where the Treasury have big problems with cost of living, housing reform planning reform specifically, does not need to cost the government a lot of money. I think really fundamentally, there's not just one thing because it's a complex piece of work, but if the government could take steps to streamline the MPPF, particularly for SME, small sites, I think a reasonable cut-off would be sites where it's less than a hectare, urban sites particularly, and where there were maybe less than 50 new homes coming forward. We haven't really talked about it, but one of the big problems another big problem, if you like, for SME small sites is the whole S106 affordable housing contributions cliff edge that kicks in at 10 units. There's no reality in which a site with 20 flats on it or 20 small homes is going to be viable for an affordable housing operator to manage 2 or 3 of those homes. It's just not viable. And the extra time that it takes to negotiate the viability assessments, the S106 discussions and negotiations attached to those additional pieces of bureaucracy kill many, many, many small schemes. The GDP economic benefits of bringing forward more SME small sites far outweigh the fact that you might be foregoing theoretically some extra affordable housing by changing the rules to say that below 50 houses, not below 20 or 10, was required to have an affordable housing contribution or an S106 contribution. Coming on to the what could be done positively, I think that the most important. There's a couple of things. I think that we should really be contemplating moving towards a zonal planning system rather than just a discretionary planning system. It seems crazy to me that every time a small site wants to come forward, you have to start from scratch justifying why there's a demand for housing. We all know there's demand for housing. It's a nationally understood issue. It's a huge amount of waste of bureaucracy to be doing these big extra reports that then get analysed and scrutinised about, do we really need housing? Yes, we do. It's unnecessary. But the discretionary process we have requires that at the moment. I think that it would be very helpful for government to put in place some sort of dedicated small sites route to success. Again, if it was just focused on urban sites, just focused on sites of less than 50 units, that could massively accelerate and empower thousands of jobs and drive UK GDP and help housing supply across the market.
Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
The MPPF should really be giving a much clearer guidance to planning officers on what I'd call some kind of weighted balance presumption in favour of approval for small or urban sites, rather than having to be deferring to all sorts of conflicting consultees who are not really ever intended originally to be necessarily even involved in directly influencing planning decisions. Small sites should be exempt from housing affordable S106 contributions because the economics of bringing them forward and the extra jobs created are far outweighing the fact that theoretical affordable housing, which doesn't really happen, is just an unnecessary burden. One other point is that, as I've already mentioned, all businesses would prefer political certainty and not, maybe if the government agreed they were not going to make any more changes to the planning system, whatever changes they do in this next round until after the next election, would be a small step. It does seem I don't know how we square this circle politically, but planning and house building it doesn't move at the speed of social media. Social media makes us kind of all want to do everything super fast and quick, and what's the latest new. Housing and planning developing is something that's going to be done, that's going to last for the next 100 years. We need just much greater certainty of timeline around policy, at least for the next 4 or 5 years during the lifetime of a project, to enable SMEs to take the considerable economic risks involved.
Do you think planning reform is addressing the real barriers to housing delivery at the moment?
From an SME, small site developer perspective, the NPPF is overly burdensome, and I do worry that just tinkering with the edges of it is not really going to make any consequential difference to my business or other businesses like ours. As I mentioned earlier, a dedicated small sites route to success process with the clear economic business case behind that, like from a government perspective, for example, would be very helpful. And having greater certainty through a more zonal based system rather than just a discretionary system is something that most other advanced economies have. The Centre for Cities have written some great papers on this subject, and government should be seriously considering that. And also there's a clear opportunity to use a lot of AI and much more data to automate and augment the systems that planning officers have.
You're essentially saying that the reforms are focused on the wrong problems?
Well, I'm not sure they're focused on the wrong problems, but I question whether the processes won't just ever become more complex. And through, there's no doubt that Steve Reed as the Housing Secretary and the government as a whole are very keen to encourage more building, but through extra consultation, there is a risk of just adding complexity and achieving the opposite of goal to the objective they're trying to achieve.
Many developers say projects are becoming harder to make viable. What pressures are you seeing in the market today?
Planning uncertainty, extra bureaucracy, time delays are a big problem for all developers, particularly for small developers who work on tight margins. Not only in the last couple of years have we seen increasing challenges around the cost of debt, the increasing challenges around building safety, where we have a whole new raft of building safety legislation that has to be complied with. We're seeing increasing cost in construction, maybe not rampant at the minute, but who knows in the near future with the uncertainties in the wider world where that's going around. And then even when you've built a site, there is increasing uncertainty around exit values and exit selling properties. As a buyer of a property, mortgage costs are harder to come by. Saving for deposits in the cost of living crisis is a problem. So the whole business plan is riddled with challenges.
Do you think that finance is becoming harder to access for smaller developers then?
Absolutely. Against the backdrop of all the challenges that I've already talked about, finding a site that's viable to finance against not only just an uncertain planning but all the other factors is not for the faint-hearted.
PPR Estates has focused on repurposing underused buildings. How big is the opportunity for regeneration in UK town centres?
Yeah, at PPR Estates we have a focus strategy based on adaptive reuse, regen and value-added strategies around urban regeneration, high streets, town centres, and as we've seen over the last few years with the changing use of high streets where they've shrunken, as we've seen with AI impacting and COVID impacting the way in which people use as offices, and a lot of offices no longer being viable. There is a lot of opportunities to repurpose and add value to town centres in an environmentally friendly way.
Do you think there are particular types of buildings with the biggest potential?
One of the things that I personally am frustrated about is how difficult it is often to get planning approval to convert the uppers of shops, for example, and existing buildings into residential units, given some of the administrative requirements that are similar to as if they were a greenfield site. I think that permitted development has been good to some extent, although the initial implementation of it was possibly abused by some people where room sizes and whatever were not met. I think with clearly understood design codes and quality standards, and again more of a zonal system, there could be a great improvement in the reuse of a lot of existing infrastructure towards housing and other uses that is a missed opportunity by the government.
Just for clarification for viewers, etc., you've mentioned zonal as opposed to discretionary. What exactly is zonal in terms of the planning and so forth?
Simplistically, zonal would just suggest that, for example, in a local plan, if you look at them now, they tend to have a very small number of sites that are allocated for new housing, for example. There's no reason why the whole of an urban centre couldn't be designated within a zonal system, provided that design codes were met and design standards were met for intensification of new residential, which could potentially unlock dozens and dozens of new sites without much complexity.
What do you think the UK development landscape will look like over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I'm not necessarily fully qualified to forecast that better than anybody else, but all I can say is that I don't speak to any SME small site developer who's not really struggling at the moment, particularly in relation to house building. Something's got to change there, and I'm aware that we're all aware that there is a great need for more housing nationally, and I'm optimistic that the government are very keen and that they're listening and will want to put in place some of the suggestions that industry are putting forward, so we can all work forward together to try and meet the crisis.
If the government does take on board those suggestions, can you see SME developers growing and taking a bigger slice of the house building that's needed?
Absolutely. The reality is that the SME sector has collapsed, and the major developers are not necessarily building that much more as a result. It's just that there's almost a third of the sector, of the house building sector, is just not delivering at the moment, as the national target numbers over the next 5 years or so are indicating. I know of many small firms, local businesses who would be very keen to bring forward small sites if they were viable. In closing, it would be very beneficial from a Homes England perspective to have much more focus on trying to support that alongside the planning processes that we need refining.